Thank you, Hilary. I've entitled this brief presentation, it's an introduction really, Radical Futures. But I think what we've got to remember is that times are always changing in museums. Believe me, I've been around long enough, about 30 years working in museums, and there's no such thing as any kind of steady state. We're in a constant state of change. And while we can look around us and think that the pressures are new, the pressures are different, the pressures are pretty much the same as I've been used to for a number of years. It's just that they're a bit different. But the future, as a consequence, is always radical, from whichever standpoint you take. I think the main change in museums over the past 3 decades has been the bigger roles that museums now play than they used to when I began in the 80s, socially and economically. And it's important that we remember that their social role, because every so often politicians become preoccupied with the economic value of museums. And that's not a bad thing, it's a great thing, but it's not the only thing that we achieve. And we've got to beware becoming obsessed with the kind of incomes that we can help bring in to wherever we are. And of course, as we all live in communities which are under different levels of stress, somewhere like Liverpool still has high unemployment, still looking towards a future where money can be earned from incomers to the city, tourists and so on. It's very important that the museums play a proper role in that. But it's equally important, if not more important, that we play a proper role for the people that live in Liverpool as well, not just the people that we want to attract there. And I say this, it's probably in all our heads, but we just have to beware the pressure all the time to think of our economic value, because if we only think about that, we risk forgetting the enormous social impact that museums have shown we can have. What this all means is what's asked of our workforce, the museum workforce, which is also in a constant state of change. There's never been a greater need for the MA to understand, second-guess and respond to the ever-growing demands that are being made of us, and also, where appropriate, to represent the museum sector as a whole in all its glorious diversity. In this context, the record-breaking membership levels and attendance at this conference are reassuring indicators that the Museums Association is doing its job in this, but of course we can always be better. So museums change lives, and the now revised Code of Ethics, which we're hoping will pass through the annual general meeting tomorrow, are initiatives by the MA to help equip museums with some of the tools we need to take advantage of the many opportunities that are currently open to us and to deal with some of the emerging issues. Both are parts of our wide-ranging workforce development strategy. These emerging issues are many and complex, and they're not all negative, but we do have an issue with which we must deal that never quite goes away, but is probably now more acute than ever before, which is funding. At a time when museums have never been more popular and impactful, we find that public funding, public investment in what we do, is shrinking. I'd just like to quote from an article I read recently in The Times, entitled "Why the Arts Put Britain on the World Stage." I'll tell you who wrote it in a moment. I quote, "You can't fully appreciate the story of the modern economy without contemplating the Industrial Revolution. That means understanding places such as Coalville, the Leicestershire town built on Britain's mining industry. And understanding Coalville means visiting the area's museum in Snibston, except that you can't. Not anymore. In an effort to save money earlier this year, Leicestershire County Council closed Snibston Museum. It was the 43rd British museum to shut its doors since 2010. Nor is it alone. Across the country, local galleries, libraries and theatres are closing in record numbers. This lesson of the unintended consequences of austerity is worth considering over the coming weeks. As you read this, ministers and special advisors are going into battle with the Treasury over their budgets. While the average cut to unprotected departments, just under 20% in real terms between now and 2020, will be slightly smaller than those inflicted in the last Parliament, the low-hanging fruit has already gone. The extraneous jobs have been culled, the obvious programmes have been removed. This time the job will be far harder. Certainly, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has already taken an enormous cut. Between 2010 and 2015, its budget was slashed by just over a quarter in real terms. Today, less taxpayers' money is spent on culture and recreation than any time since comparable records began in 1991. The number of people working in arts and, and culture is actually quite small. Unlike medicine, law enforcement, or even international development, their contribution to the country's welfare is not easily quantified. But both of these facts put at grave risk in the coming negotiations. The cuts to spending on culture and the arts may not be visible on the surface, especially if you live in London. The National Theatre is still thriving. No major museums are closed. It's still as difficult as ever to get a ticket to West End theatres, musicals and the opera. The biggest impact has been felt outside the capital, in places like Snibston, where government support is needed most. We've been here before. The 20th century's greatest economist, John Maynard Keynes, confronted it during the Second World War. As he worked to overhaul the world's monetary system, Keynes was busy setting up the Arts Council. The worst thing the Victorians ever did, he wrote, was to slash their funding for the arts. Now, this was written by Ed Conway, who's economics editor of Sky News in the Times, all part of the Murdoch empire. And it's always interesting to get perspectives from out with our profession. There are things that we kind of would say, wouldn't we? But this is the economics editor of Sky News talking about the unintended risks that the nation is running because of the austerity programme. And there are a number of insights in what Ed Conway said. He refers to museum closures. Arguably, there are more to come, and the MA needs to keep its eye out for these. It doesn't mean to say that all museum closures are bad, a point Sharon made. That may not be the case. Each individual case needs looking at as an individual case. It may well be that some closures are warranted for one reason or another. And, I mean, I've closed several museums in my career in order to develop other things. You know, sometimes that's what you do. But we've got a bit of a quantum shift here because we may well be closing down places that are really, really valuable. And that's one of the changes that we have. Another reference that Ed made was to the imbalance in spending of public money. Now, 2 years ago at this conference, Chairman of Arts Council England, Sir Peter Bazalgette, asked this conference to judge the Arts Council England's response to this imbalance, perceived imbalance, in 2 years' time. It was 2 years ago, so it's time to judge. Now, Darren Henley, who's speaking to us at this conference, Chief Exec of Arts Council England, says that, he said this yesterday, so I'm assuming this is right, says that by 2018, 75% of Arts Council England spend will be in England outside London. Now, that sounds better, but the Arts Council has always spent a lot of money outside London. You know, I've never worked in London. I've always worked outside London, and I've always been conscious of Arts Council investment wherever I've been, whether I've been working in York or Leeds or Hull or Newcastle, Sunderland or latterly Liverpool. There are other issues. It's not just all about Arts Council England spend or indeed Arts Councils in any of our nations. In terms of other bodies' cultural spend, we need to watch the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in England, which has announced a forthcoming white paper, in itself a radical move towards having a policy for museums in England, though, of course, we have already seen such policy work in other UK nations. Conway referred to problems in smaller museums becoming more widely acknowledged, I think, nowadays than ever before. I think there's a growing sense that politicians concentrate their attentions on the big museums, particularly the nationally funded museums, and the risk is that they overlook the consequences of everywhere else because they're not just quite so visible. And I think there's a growing awareness that if we have a crisis, and I think we do, that the crisis is at its most acute in the smaller museums of various types. Other issues that are taxing the museum profession at the moment: sponsorship. Where is our sponsorship coming from? We're all being pressed into raising money from non-public sources. This raises a new set of issues for us in terms of ethics. It's scrutiny by the public of sponsorship and where we're getting our money from is not going to go away. It's extremely tricky. And those of you that are here from the British Museum and other institutions will know that there is some outrage at the prospect, some of the prospects of taking money from certain sources. That's democracy for you. You will have people complaining about this, so we've got to watch that. The subject of admission charges, very complex. It might be a partial solution to funding issues in some museums. It might be the whole solution in some museums. It's not the answer in all museums. Sharon referred to the sale of collections, such as Northampton and its outrageous sale of Sekemka, which happily, as far as I know, has not been replicated on a wide scale yet. It's still early days. This is an especially tricky one because my sense is that the public has no understanding of why museums might not want to dispose of anything for financial reasons. On the contrary, many of the public that I met during the Sekemka arguments was saying, well, what's wrong with selling something? You know, if that means that the museum has a future, why wouldn't you do that? I've got trustees who ask me the same kind of questions. But we have, you know, hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of pounds worth of assets in our collections, and we're short of the money needed to do this, that, and the other valuable function. Why not just sell something? I think these questions are going to continue to be asked, and we need to be really robust as a sector if we think that that's a position that we must defend. Another issue is devolution of powers from central government, particularly in England, because we've already had many years of devolution of powers from Westminster to the UK nations. We're now trying to come to terms with the confused and somewhat mysterious process of devolution within England as well. Who knows where that's going to end? We may find out more on the 25th of November when the Chancellor of the Exchequer announces his comprehensive spending review. We may or we may not. I know, for example, that negotiations are ongoing. Somewhat, not, behind closed doors make it sound secretive. Negotiations always happen behind closed doors. That's the nature of negotiations. But not everybody knows what's happening. We know what we read in the press. People leak things to the press. There are clearly discussions going on about devolution. What will that mean for museums, whether that's Northern Powerhouse or indeed anywhere else? We may find out more at this conference. I hope we do. Then there's international work. We're being pressed into doing more and more international work. That's never, ever easy. In fact, it's extremely difficult. Now, all this means that museums need to work differently to be more commercial in outlook. For example, it means museum staff have to develop new skills. It means museums need to advocate our value more than we have hitherto. To stop suggesting that we can see off the reductions in public funding by becoming more enterprising. Some perhaps can. Some perhaps don't require public funding at all, but many do. Solutions that might work in York or London may well not work in Barnsley or Birkenhead or Whitehaven or Ebbw Vale or Derry or Dundee. In finding new ways to work, new attitudes, new skills, we have to be careful we do not lose other key functions such as caring for collections, working with disadvantaged people, ensuring that everyone in society has the opportunity to gain from access to museums and what we do. This balance is our challenge, and finding this balance is the key to ensuring that museums do indeed have a radical future. Thank you.